The first time I noticed something was off with my son, it wasn't the slammed cabinet doors or the requests for money that stung more than they should. It was that moment when he looked me dead in the eyes, smiled just a little too long, and carried himself like he'd finally figured out the world. Like I was the one still fumbling in the dark. In that small kitchen, under the tired lights of our house in Minneapolis, the space between us was charged sharp and heavy, something ready to snap. Every object felt louder. The fork tapping on the plate, the fridge humming, the winter wind outside scratching at the window panes. You could almost smell the tension, thicker than the scent of meatloaf cooling on chipped ceramic. That night, we'd sat around the dinner table, me, my son David, his wife Erin, trying to act like family. The clock on the wall was an old one, a hand-me-down from my father. Ticked too loudly. I set down my fork when David slammed his fist so hard the salt shaker toppled, spraying salt like snow across the table. His jaw was tight, voice clipped as he told me they needed another 2,000. Not asked, told. Erin's mascara smudged under her eyes, a silent message of tears shed behind closed doors. For a moment, all I saw was the boy he'd been, bundled in a Viking sweatshirt, looking up at me with absolute trust. Now, his gaze was cold, older than his years. I felt something break open in my chest, a kind of tired anger. I reminded him, maybe more myself than him, that he was 28, and that I'd already helped more than any father should. Paid for the wedding, covered their rent, their car trouble, Erin's health scares, the dental bill last year. The words came out brittle, almost foreign in my own mouth. There was a silence then, deep enough to hear Erin's rings click against the glass as she twisted them over and over, staring at her plate as if the pattern might change if she looked long enough. David's eyes flashed. "You're selfish," he said. "You never cared. Mom would have helped." My late wife's name still cut through me like ice. She was the soft spot, the excuse for all their pleading and my every weakness. A wave of guilt, resentment, and old love washed over me so fast it made me dizzy. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in around our broken version of family. I pushed back from the table, the legs of my chair scraping hard on linoleum. I didn't want to see the look in David's eyes as I left the room. Upstairs, my bedroom was barely warmer than the rest of the house. I kept it the way Lila had left it 5 years ago, after the cancer took her. Her perfume bottle, almost empty now, sat next to her favorite book. Sometimes, when the house was especially quiet, I would open it just to remember her scent. Sweet, floral, almost enough to feel her in the room. That night, I sat on the bed and stared at her photo in the soft lamplight. Her smile still held forgiveness. I wanted her to tell me what to do, how to fix things, how to be the father David needed and the man she once believed in. But the quiet didn't offer any answers, only the steady ache in my back and the cold, hard lump of fear in my gut. I opened the drawer and pulled out a stack of old paperwork, reminders of all the times I'd bailed David out. Loans in my name, medical bills, the credit card statement from when Erin's tooth broke and they couldn't afford the emergency dentist. I traced the signature line on each page, remembering how each time had felt like the last, and each time I told myself it would be different. Lila's last words haunted me. "Let him grow up, Mark. Don't let him hide in your shadow forever." I barely slept that night. When I finally drifted off, it was with the sound of their voices echoing from downstairs, a private argument that never seemed to end. I wondered what I'd missed, how things had gotten this far. When I woke before dawn, the house felt different, as if it knew something I didn't. Morning in Minnesota can be unforgiving, all gray light and the taste of old coffee. I pulled on my flannel and boots, moving through the kitchen in automatic, watching the sun rise slow and pale over the snowbanks outside. I made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and set about washing last night's dishes, my mind running over the argument on a loop. Erin came down first, her hair pulled back and face set in that careful, hopeful mask she wore whenever she wanted something from me. "Good morning," she said, and I just nodded. David followed, moving slow and stiff, avoiding my eyes as he poured his coffee. I watched him, waiting for some sign that things might turn, that we'd find a way back. But there was nothing, just the distant rumble of the neighbor's truck starting up and the soft sound of Aaron burning toast. The silence between us was a canyon. I focused on the small things, the motion of the sponge, the feel of the warm water. When David finally spoke, his voice was flat. "I've got job interviews today." I handed him the house key, the weight of the gesture hanging between us. For a second, I wondered if he'd come back at all. I went out to the garage, the cold biting through my jacket. The old Ford pickup waited for me, the one I'd saved for since before David was born. The smell of sawdust and oil made me feel almost steady, like the world could still be fixed if you knew where to put the effort in. I drove through the city, past the iced-over lakes, and thought about every choice that had led me here. By the time I pulled back into the driveway, the snow had started again, soft flakes blurring the world outside. The day drifted on. Sometime in the afternoon, David returned, loud and animated, announcing he'd landed a job at a tech firm downtown, TechCore Systems. The relief in his voice was real, or close enough to pass. Aaron made a show of celebrating, clapping and smiling, almost convincing. I wanted to believe it was true, that maybe this would be the turning point. Maybe all the late nights, all the arguments, all the sacrifices had been worth it, just for this moment. We decided to grill burgers just like old times, as if we could cook the bitterness out of our lives with a little char and smoke. I lit the charcoal on the deck, the smoke curling up into the early evening air. The house behind me glowed with warm light. David said he needed to grab something from upstairs, papers, maybe, from the interview. I was halfway through stacking burgers on the plate when I caught a movement through the kitchen window. David was inside, hunched over my backpack, my work bag, the one I kept in the closet. He looked around quick, checked the hall, and then slipped something dark and small into the bag. His hands moved too carefully, like someone trying not to leave prints. I froze, a sick feeling crawling up my spine. For a moment, I thought about all the ways I could be wrong. Maybe he was hiding a gift or something innocent. But his body language, the furtive way he zipped up the bag and walked away, said something else. I stared at the smoke from the grill, willing myself to breathe steady, to act normal. He came out onto the deck, face smooth, asking how the burgers were coming. I answered on autopilot, mind spinning, replaying the scene in my head. When he ducked back inside for a moment, I seized my chance. Heart pounding, I went in through the side door, quietly unzipped the backpack, and searched through the pockets. There, wrapped in black tissue, was a ring. Heavy, glittering, real. A diamond set in platinum, more expensive than anything David had ever owned. My mind raced. The police had been on the news just last week, talking about a string of jewelry thefts from local shops. I suddenly saw the trap in perfect clarity. David was trying to set me up, plant the evidence, and let me take the fall. The horror of it swept over me, cold and absolute. I slid the ring into my pocket, zipped the bag closed, and steadied myself. The next hour was a blur of forced conversation and the taste of ashes in my mouth. Burgers gone cold on the plate. I watched David closely, the little tells. How he glanced at the bag, the too bright laughter, the way he hovered around the kitchen. Erin pretended not to notice, but her eyes flicked from David to me, a silent warning in her gaze. It was almost 7 when the first squad car pulled into the drive. The blue and red lights bounced across the snow, painting wild patterns on the ceiling. David's face went tight, then hopeful. Erin's hands trembled, clutching her mug like a lifeline. I stood in the hallway, listening to the muffled knock at the front door. A female officer in uniform, face set and eyes sharp, stepped inside. She asked about a report, a tip from a concerned son about his elderly father's suspicious behavior. She said there was evidence, that someone had seen me with stolen jewelry matching the description of a piece missing from a break-in that week. David pointed at me, voice steady and full of practiced shock. "It's in his bag." I saw him put it there. The world slowed. My own son, standing next to me, telling strangers I was a thief. The cop turned to me, her gaze unreadable. I felt all the years between us, every sacrifice, every moment of pride or regret, stretching out and snapping tight. She asked to search the house, the bag. My hands shook as I handed it over, the emptiness in my gut growing. David's eyes widened when she pulled the pockets inside out and found nothing but tools and old receipts. He tried to recover, fumbling for words. "Maybe it's in his room," I said, my voice calm and cold. "Maybe you should check his dresser." The officer looked at me for a long moment, then nodded to her partner. David went pale as she headed upstairs. Down below, in the fading light of a Minnesota evening, everything I thought I knew about my son changed forever. The sense of betrayal was raw, total, like a wound torn open in public. For the first time, I felt old, not just in years, but in spirit. And yet, beneath the heartbreak, something else stirred, a resolve sharper than any pain. I knew, as I watched the patrol lights sweep across the walls, that this was only the beginning. The truth was out there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to break everything apart. And I wouldn't stop until I found it, no matter the cost. When the house finally went quiet that night, long after the flashing lights had faded and the police car had rolled down the block, I sat at the edge of my bed with a heaviness in my bones I couldn't shake. My hands were still trembling, my breath shallow and uneven, like the wind outside scraping icy branches against the siding. The ache that lived in my chest was older than any betrayal. It was the slow, grinding pain that comes from loving too much, too long, and never quite knowing when the line between love and self-destruction had been crossed. In the dim glow of my bedside lamp, I looked around at the room Lila had once filled with laughter and warmth. Her perfume still lingered faintly on the air, a reminder of the person who could calm me with just a touch on my shoulder or a soft word when life felt overwhelming. The walls were lined with photographs. Lila in her yellow dress at the Old North Loop Farmers Market, David as a boy holding up his first northern pike on the shore of Lake Minnetonka, Aaron smiling awkwardly at their wedding reception in the church basement. Each image was a piece of the life I'd worked for, loved for, and given everything to protect. But the truth was, there had always been cracks. The night Lila died, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Mark, you have to let him grow. You can't keep saving him forever." I'd nodded, numb with grief, telling myself I understood. But the world was different without her. After she was gone, every silence in the house was bigger. Every request for help from David felt heavier, more urgent, as if it were the only thing keeping us from falling apart completely. I tried to close my eyes and drift into sleep, but my mind kept looping through old memories. The years I worked overtime at the sheet metal plant, the sacrifices Lila made just so we could afford to buy this house, the endless miles on my old Ford hauling David to hockey practice, college visits, job interviews that never turned into jobs. I saw myself pawning my prized Harley, the one I'd rebuilt from the ground up after Lila's funeral, just to help pay for David and Aaron's wedding. I remembered emptying out my retirement savings to cover their rent when David got laid off for the third time in 2 years, quietly swallowing my pride as I handed over the check, hoping it would finally make a difference. In the quiet, I realized that what hurt most wasn't the money or the sacrifices, but the growing emptiness in David's eyes every time he looked at me. There was no gratitude, no sense of connection left. Only a cold calculation, as if he'd decided somewhere along the way that I was a resource to be tapped until there was nothing left. Still, I kept finding ways to justify his choices, to explain away the bitterness in his voice or the desperation in his late-night calls. That's what parents do, isn't it? We tell ourselves it's all worth it, that love will heal whatever's broken. As the hours crept by, I moved through the house in the dark, running my fingers along the grooves in the banister, feeling the worn edges of the photos on the mantel. I paused in the living room, staring at the spot where David used to line up his toy trucks, where Lila once rocked him to sleep after a fever. I found myself wishing for a different kind of ache, the kind that comes from missing someone you loved well, not the kind that comes from seeing what they've become. At sunrise, I went to the garage, sat in the front seat of the Ford, and let the engine idle in the cold. My mind replayed the events of the night before, each detail sharper than the last. The ring, the backpack, the look of absolute certainty in David's face when he accused me. I wondered if he'd planned it alone, or if Aaron had helped. I wondered how long they'd been thinking about what would happen to the house, to my savings, to everything I had left, if I suddenly disappeared. The thought made my hands clench so hard on the steering wheel that my knuckles ached. When I returned inside, the silence was brittle, like glass ready to shatter. Erin stood in the kitchen, hair still damp from the shower, eyes red from crying. She tried to make small talk, but I could hear the tremor in her voice, see the guilt in her every movement. I tried to search her face for signs of remorse, for any hint that she was trapped in something she didn't want. But there was nothing, just exhaustion, fear, and the stubborn hope that maybe things could still be fixed. David barely looked at me as he shuffled in, clutching his phone, scanning the news as if nothing had happened. I watched him pour cereal into a bowl, the motions too casual, too practiced, like someone who'd rehearsed this scene 1,000 times. For a moment, I thought about the years I'd spent teaching him how to fix things. Broken bicycles, leaky faucets, the lawn mower that never wanted to start in spring. The lessons had all been about patience, about doing the job right even when it was hard. Now I saw the irony, how much easier it was to mend a machine than to fix a broken relationship. I wanted to scream, to ask him why, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I tried to remember the boy I'd once known, the kid who used to beg me to take him fishing at Lake Harriet, who once spent a summer building a treehouse in the backyard with nothing but bent nails and wild imagination. I tried to find some piece of him left in the man now sitting across from me, but all I could see was the wall he'd built between us. The next few days blurred into a pattern of tense silences and small, desperate routines. I mowed the snow off the driveway with a shovel, drove to the store for groceries I didn't need, tinkered with the furnace even though it was working fine. Each task felt meaningless, but it kept my hands busy, gave my mind something to do besides dwell on the growing distance between me and David. At night, I lay awake, listening for the sound of footsteps in the hall, half expecting to hear Lila's voice telling me that it was all just a bad dream. Sometimes, when the loneliness was too much, I'd call my old friend Alan, a retired firefighter who lived down the street. We'd talk about the Vikings, about the cold, about the small frustrations of growing old in a world that no longer seemed to care. Alan never pried, never asked about David or Erin. He understood the unwritten rules of men like us. Sometimes silence was the only comfort we had left to offer each other. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the basement, I found a letter from Lila, written years before her illness. Her handwriting was neat and precise, every word a small act of hope. She wrote about the future, about dreams she had for me and David, about wanting him to become a man who could stand on his own. She wrote, "Mark, if you're reading this after I'm gone, promise me you'll let him fall. Let him learn. He needs to find his own strength." The letter was a punch to the gut. I'd spent so many years ignoring her advice, believing that love was measured by how much pain you could carry for someone else. Now I saw how wrong I'd been, how each act of rescue had only built another wall between me and the son I thought I was saving. I folded the letter and placed it back in the box. The weight of it settled into my chest, a slow-burning regret that threatened to consume me. I began to understand that the greatest act of love I could give David wasn't another loan or another second chance, but the courage to let him bear the consequences of his choices. I started to notice the small lies, the inconsistencies in his stories, the way he and Erin would retreat into whispered arguments when they thought I wasn't listening. I watched them watch me, eyes calculating, waiting for the moment I might falter. But something had changed in me. The old reflex to protect, to smooth over the cracks, had been replaced by a fierce, almost stubborn resolve. I would not let them take everything I had left. I would not let their choices define the rest of my life. I promised Lila, silently, that I would honor her wish. For the first time since she died, I felt a glimmer of strength, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. Still, the uncertainty gnawed at me. I replayed the events of the past week again and again, searching for signs I might have missed. A look, a word, a gesture that could have warned me of what was coming. I wondered how much of my life had been spent walking blind through the darkness, trusting that love was enough to protect me. The next morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and studied my own reflection. The lines on my face were deeper than I remembered. My hair had gone gray at the temples. I looked tired, worn down, but beneath it all there was a clarity in my eyes I hadn't seen in years. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever storm was coming, I would not be swept away by it. I walked through the house one last time, running my hand over the banister, saying a silent goodbye to the life I'd built. I lingered in David's old room, traced the faded pencil marks on the doorframe where we'd measured his height year after year. I knelt by the window and looked out over the backyard, remembering the laughter, the birthday parties, the quiet moments when everything felt possible. Then, with a final breath, I turned and walked downstairs, ready to face whatever came next. The past was gone, the future uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I felt alive, wounded, yes, but alive in a way that made the pain almost bearable. I knew there would be more tests, more heartbreak, but I also knew that I was finally ready to fight for myself, for the life Lila had wanted for me, and for the kind of love that doesn't ask you to sacrifice everything just to keep it alive. I spent the next morning in a haze, every muscle wound tight, every sound in the house a jolt to my system. I couldn't shake the image of David's face as he accused me, the confidence, the hint of satisfaction behind his eyes. I replayed every detail from the night before, each memory sharper now, like the chill that crept beneath the floorboards in the long Minnesota winter. My mind darted from one possibility to another, grasping for some innocent explanation, but the evidence kept dragging me back to one unavoidable truth. My own son had set me up. The ache was worse than any physical pain I'd known. I walked through the rooms of my home, looking at every object as if it might contain a clue. The coffee table where Lila and I once set out board games for David, the old couch, worn and sagging from decades of use, where family movie nights had made the world feel safe and simple. It all felt different now, touched by suspicion, corrupted by a betrayal that ran deeper than I was ready to admit. As the hours dragged on, my mind sharpened. I stopped trying to find excuses for David. Instead, I began to catalog his movements, his words, every sidelong glance between him and Aaron. There was a brittle quality to the way they carried themselves, an undercurrent of panic barely concealed beneath the routine of daily life. Aaron moved quietly, almost too quietly, her eyes flickering away whenever I looked at her. David stayed busy, always in motion, tapping away on his phone, pretending to work on his resume at the kitchen table, but mostly staring off into some distant, unreachable place. I thought of Lila's last letter, the one I'd found in the basement just days ago. Her words circled in my mind as I watched David move through the house. If you love him, let him fall. I wondered if she'd foreseen any of this, if she'd somehow known that letting go would mean more than just stepping back. It would mean risking everything, risking the idea of family itself. The tension reached a breaking point on a Wednesday afternoon, gray light filtering in through dirty windows, the old furnace rattling in the basement. David had left for an errand. His voice unusually bright, his smile forced and brittle. I waited until the front door closed, then moved through the house with quiet purpose. My hands didn't tremble as much now. I'd spent years as a machinist, working with tools and delicate parts, learning how to steady myself when it mattered. That focus became my anchor. I started in the living room, searching for anything out of place. Nothing. I made my way to the kitchen, opening drawers, lifting the cushions on the chairs. Everything seemed normal. In the hallway, a framed photo caught my attention. David at age 10, grinning and holding up a battered baseball glove, Lila's arm around his shoulders. For a split second, I felt the urge to smash the glass, to destroy the memory that no longer fit the man he'd become. But I set it back gently, careful not to leave fingerprints. Upstairs, I paused outside David and Aaron's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the soft hum of the humidifier they used for Aaron's allergies. I entered, careful to disturb as little as possible. The room was tidy, too tidy, the kind of order that comes not from habit but from someone trying to cover their tracks. I moved to the dresser, pulling open drawers one by one. The usual clutter: socks, t-shirts, a jumble of receipts and ticket stubs. In the second drawer, beneath a pile of sweaters, I found something that stopped me cold. The same black tissue paper from the night before, folded around a small velvet box. I opened it and stared. The diamond ring gleamed in the muted afternoon light, cold and perfect, exactly as I'd found it in my backpack. For a moment, I just stood there, the world narrowing down to that tiny, glittering stone. My mind spun through every possibility. Had David realized I'd found the ring? Was he planning to hide it somewhere else? Or was this part of a larger plan, a way to cast doubt on my version of events? A wave of anger surged through me, raw and volcanic. I shoved the box back into the drawer, buried it under the sweaters, and closed it as quietly as I could. My pulse hammered in my ears. I had evidence now, a fragment of truth that might one day save me. But I also had the sickening realization that David's betrayal ran deeper than I'd imagined. I left their room and went back downstairs, forcing myself to move slowly, to act normal. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the empty street. My thoughts churned. I considered my options. I could confront David directly, force a confession, but I doubted he'd break. He was too practiced now, too skilled at turning guilt into accusation. I could go to the police, but what would I say? My word against the word of an old man against his ambitious, charismatic son. And if he'd already tried to set me up once, who's to say he didn't have other tricks waiting? The rest of the day passed in a daze, every interaction laced with hidden meaning. Erin cooked dinner, her hands moving quickly, her voice higher than usual as she asked about my plans for the week. David joined us at the table, his eyes bright, too bright, as he recounted stories of his job search and joked about the weather. The air was thick with pretense. I played along, matching his tone, but underneath I was charting every word, every glance, every twitch of his fingers. That night, after the dishes were done and the lights turned low, I sat in my room with the door closed and made a decision. I would not be the victim of David's story. If he wanted to write a script where I was the villain, I'd have to be one step ahead. My mind whirred with possibilities, the habits of a lifetime of problem-solving kicking in. I began to keep notes, scribbling details in an old notebook I kept hidden in my sock drawer. Times, dates, odd conversations, everything that might one day fit together into a pattern. The next day, I watched David more closely. He spent long hours in his room, talking on the phone in low tones, sending texts and quickly deleting them. Erin left for work at the hospital, her absence leaving a vacuum that made the house feel even more dangerous. I checked the ring again, making sure it was still there, still hidden where only I knew to look. As the week wore on, I started to see the shape of the trap David had set. He was careful, always presenting himself as the dutiful son, always making sure to drop hints about my forgetfulness, my age, to anyone who would listen, neighbors, friends, even the pharmacist when we went to refill my blood pressure meds. He painted a picture of an old man losing his grip, one who might easily stumble into trouble, one whose word would mean little against the mounting evidence. The realization was a cold weight in my stomach. This wasn't about a single crime or a moment of desperation. This was a long con, one that had taken root months, maybe years ago. Every act of kindness, every loan, every second chance I'd given him had become another piece of ammunition he could use against me. I saw it now in the way he spoke to Erin, the way he managed her fears, coaxed her into silence when she started to question the story. The only comfort I found was in small moments. Calls from Alan, the neighbor's dog barking at nothing, the familiar creak of the floorboards in the hall. I clung to these details, the rhythms of an ordinary life, as a shield against the chaos David was trying to unleash. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening, the storm broke. David burst into the kitchen, his face flushed with excitement or fear. It was hard to tell. He announced that he'd been offered a second interview, that things were finally turning around. Erin hugged him, her relief almost palpable. And for a moment I let myself believe it was real. But then, as they celebrated, I caught a look pass between them. A flicker of something cold and calculating. Later, as I washed up alone, I realized that David had left his phone on the counter. The screen was lit up, a string of messages visible before it locked. The words blurred, but I caught enough to know they weren't about job interviews. My heart pounded. I resisted the urge to dig deeper. Instead, I made a note, another entry in my growing catalog of suspicions. That night, lying in bed, I felt the weight of the secret I was carrying. The ring hidden in the dresser, the notebook of evidence, the growing sense that I was living in enemy territory. But with the fear came a kind of clarity. I understood now that my only chance was to be patient, to let David believe he was still in control. If I moved too soon, I'd lose everything. But if I waited, watched, gathered every shred of evidence, I might yet find a way to turn the trap back on him. I closed my eyes and pictured Lila's face, her steady gaze, her unwavering belief that the truth would win in the end. I whispered a promise to her, to myself. I would not let David destroy what was left of me. I would find a way to survive this, to reclaim my story, even if it meant sacrificing the last shreds of the family I'd worked so hard to build. And as the house settled around me, as the storm raged outside, I found a flicker of hope in the darkness, a stubborn belief that somehow, against all odds, I could still fight back. The morning after that storm, I woke in a daze, mind dull from broken sleep. For a moment, in that half-lit haze before memory returned, I believed everything might be normal again, that David was still a boy who'd ask me for help with his bike or show up in my garage, grease on his hands, eager to learn. But reality seeped back in, slow and sharp. The truth of what he'd done, the way he'd used trust like a weapon, hung between us thicker than the old winter fog that clung to Minneapolis every November. Routine became my armor. I moved through the kitchen, filling the coffee pot, straightening the stack of mail on the table, trying to look like a man who wasn't quietly fighting to keep his world from crumbling. The notebook of evidence I'd started, stashed in the back of my sock drawer, had grown heavier with every scribbled detail, every small betrayal I'd caught out of the corner of my eye. Erin barely met my gaze now. The mask she wore was starting to crack, her nerves frayed from David's relentless scheming. She lingered longer over small chores, dropped things more often, flinched at sudden sounds. The weight she carried wasn't only fear for herself. I sensed something else there, a sliver of regret, or maybe shame for the part she'd played. But she was caught, too, unable to break away from the man she'd promised to love, even as he drew her deeper into his plans. David grew bolder, convinced of his own brilliance, certain he could control every variable. I watched him stage scenes for my benefit, leaving his phone open to job postings, dropping hints about the bank accounts he claimed to be rebuilding, even asking if I needed help fixing the loose railing on the porch. Each act was calculated, a performance for anyone watching, but especially for me. Sometimes I caught him staring, expression flat and analytical, as if he were testing the limits of what I would believe. I found myself wondering more than once how it had come to this. The house we'd made a home, the life built in the seams of ordinary days, now felt like a stage set for a play I never wanted to be in. I tried to remember when I'd last laughed in David's presence, when a conversation hadn't been shaped by caution or suspicion. All that remained now was an endless chess match, every move shadowed by doubt. I waited for the next act. I knew something was coming, could feel it in the way David paced the kitchen at night, whispering with Erin in the hallway, avoiding my eyes as if he couldn't stand the sight of the father he planned to destroy. I began setting small traps of my own, subtle and quiet. I moved the ring from one hiding spot to another, kept watch on David's behavior, left the notebook out just long enough for Erin to catch a glimpse. I wanted her to know that I was paying attention, that I wasn't the helpless old man David was trying to paint for the world. The tension reached a fever pitch on a cold Saturday afternoon, the kind where the sky hovers gray and close, threatening snow. David announced that he was going out to run errands. His voice was too casual, the grin stretched too wide across his face. I watched him leave, counting the seconds until I was alone. I moved quickly, checking every place I'd hidden the ring, the notebook, every scrap of evidence I'd collected. Nothing had been touched, but a sense of dread pressed down on me, as if the walls themselves were warning me to stay alert. I called Alan, my friend down the street, and asked if he'd stop by later. His presence was a comfort, a reminder that not every connection had to be transactional, poisoned by suspicion. Alan didn't ask questions, just promised he'd come. He'd always had a way of showing up at the exact moment you needed him most. While I waited, I replayed every interaction of the past week, each word and gesture examined in the harsh light of betrayal. David returned, face flushed from the cold, hands jammed deep in his coat pockets. He moved through the house with purpose, checking the doors, glancing out the window as if expecting someone. Erin was in the kitchen, her posture rigid, knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the counter. There was something different about her, a tension that hadn't been there before. She seemed ready to bolt, eyes darting to the door every few seconds. I wondered if David's plan was unraveling, if the pressure had finally gotten to her. The answer came in the form of a knock at the door. Sharp, insistent, official. I saw the squad cars parked outside, their lights swirling red and blue against the drab gray of the street. For a second, the house was silent except for the pounding of my own heart. David stood up straighter, smoothing his hair, a little too eager as he moved toward the entryway. I followed, Alan's voice echoing in my memory. Trust your gut, Mark. Don't let them decide your story for you. The officers were calm, professional, their eyes scanning the room as if reading a script. David launched into his performance, voice steady, full of feigned concern. He explained that he'd found evidence of stolen jewelry in my possession, that he'd seen me acting strangely, forgetting things, hiding items in the garage. Every word was a calculated lie, designed to paint me as a confused, desperate old man, unfit to be trusted. I met the gaze of the lead officer, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and tired eyes. She asked for permission to search the house. I agreed, forcing myself to remain calm. As they moved through the rooms, David hovered at their elbows, directing them to my backpack, my closet, the kitchen drawers. He narrated his story as they searched, confidence leaking from every word. They found nothing. His mask slipped, just for a moment. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. The officers conferred quietly, their voices low. The lead officer turned to me, asking if there was anything I wanted to share. I hesitated only a second before nodding. If you're looking for something, maybe check the dresser in my son's room. My words were soft but carried the weight of everything I'd held inside. David's reaction was instant, pure panic. He tried to deflect, to argue, to turn the spotlight back on me. But the officers were already moving, Alan's steady presence just behind them as they entered the hallway. Erin stood frozen in the kitchen, her hands pressed flat to the counter, knuckles blanched, breathing shallow. When the officers opened the dresser, their search was quick and efficient. The ring was there, just as I'd left it, the black tissue paper crumpled around the velvet box. David's face drained of color, every ounce of bravado stripped away. They asked whose drawer it was, whose fingerprints would be on the box. I could see Erin's resolve crumbling, her shoulders shaking. David sputtered denials, weaving new lies, but the evidence spoke for itself. The officers gathered what they needed, asked more questions, and David's answers became increasingly desperate, his logic unraveling under the weight of truth. Erin broke first. Her voice was low, almost a whisper as she told them everything. How David had convinced her to go along, how he'd planned for weeks, coaching her on what to say, assuring her that it was the only way out of their mounting debt. She confessed to her role, the part she'd played, and begged for leniency. I listened, numb, as the last shreds of the family I'd known unraveled in front of me. The officers led David out in handcuffs, reading him his rights. The images burned into my memory. The boy I'd once cradled in my arms, now a stranger, eyes wild and furious as he screamed that it was all a mistake. I stood in the doorway as the car pulled away, Alan's hand resting on my shoulder, offering comfort without words. Inside, Erin sat slumped at the kitchen table, her face streaked with tears, repeating apologies that no longer meant anything. The silence was profound. I stood in the center of my ruined home, the weight of grief and relief mingling in my chest. I knew nothing would ever be the same, that the fight for truth had cost me more than I'd ever imagined. But as I looked out the window at the darkening street, I felt, for the first time in years, a fragile sense of peace. The truth had finally come to light, and I was still standing. The courthouse in downtown Minneapolis looked the same as it had for decades. Its stone facade battered by storms, the flag fluttering against the gray morning sky. But the day I walked up those steps with Alan at my side, it might as well have been another world. My legs felt heavy. Every sound echoed too loud. Every face in the corridor turned to look at the old man at the center of the story. Word had spread, as it always does, and I caught whispers as we moved through security. Snippets of gossip, the hint of disbelief that a father could be betrayed so completely by his own son. I gripped the handle of my briefcase a little tighter, trying to focus on the task ahead, not the dull ache in my chest. Inside the courtroom, everything was sharp and sterile. The air carried that dry chill, the benches lined in neat rows, the state seal glinting above the judge's bench. I tried not to look at David, seated at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists, eyes red from sleepless nights or too much thinking. He refused to meet my gaze, staring straight ahead, jaw set. Erin sat behind him, hollow-eyed, a public defender at her side. For a long moment, I let myself remember the baby I'd once rocked to sleep, the first day of kindergarten, the son who once ran laughing down the aisles of the hardware store. Then I let that image dissolve, replaced by the facts I could not ignore. The trial started with routine motions, the hum of legal language that meant nothing to anyone but the lawyers. I gave my statement, hands folded in my lap, voice steady because I'd rehearsed it so many times in the quiet of the night. The prosecutor, a brisk woman in her 50s, led me through every detail. How I'd found the ring, how I'd noticed David's strange behavior, how the plan had begun to take shape. She pressed gently, drawing out the timeline, the rising pattern of requests, the change in his tone. I watched the jury as I spoke, 12 strangers looking for the shape of the truth in every inflection of my voice. The defense tried to cast doubt. They painted me as a man struggling with memory, as someone easily confused by stress and grief. They said maybe I'd misunderstood what I saw, that I'd let suspicion cloud my judgment. But every question they asked only made the story clearer. The evidence, my notes, Erin's testimony, all of it lined up. Surveillance footage from a pawn shop in St. Paul, showing David trying to cash out a watch I'd thought long lost, played across a screen for the courtroom to see. His financial records, his gambling debts, the frantic phone calls to loan sharks, the digital trail of desperation. Erin's turn came, and she spoke softly, her voice trembling as she recounted the months of mounting pressure, the fear that kept her awake, the way David had rehearsed every word he wanted her to say. She described the night of the arrest, the look on David's face, the helpless panic when the officers found the ring where I told them to look. Her words didn't exonerate her, but they drew the lines of guilt with more nuance, revealing a woman trapped by love and fear, pushed past her limits by a man who'd forgotten how to tell the truth. As she finished, the courtroom was silent but for the ticking of the clock on the far wall. I saw the way she looked at me then, desperate for forgiveness I wasn't sure I could give. When David was finally called to the stand, his hands shook, but his eyes flashed with the last embers of pride. He started to weave another story, but it unraveled in his hands, each lie refuted by evidence, each claim cut short by the facts laid bare. The prosecutor's voice was unyielding. She read text messages aloud, confronted him with receipts, played security camera footage frame by frame. By the end, David's shoulders had sagged, his answers growing shorter, his voice fading into a whisper. The judge, a man with a stern face and clear eyes, listened to everything with a kind of weary patience. He addressed me directly at one point, asking for my perspective on David's actions, on the meaning of family, on the obligations of love. I told him what I knew, that love without limits can become a poison, that a parent's willingness to forgive must be balanced with a willingness to let go. My words trembled, but I forced myself to look at David as I spoke, to see the man he had become. Not the son I'd once hoped for, but the person shaped by choices I could no longer control. The prosecutor's closing arguments were clear and methodical. She laid out the sequence of betrayal, the mounting evidence, the motive as obvious as it was heartbreaking. She pointed to the consequences not just for me but for Aaron, for our family, for everyone who'd ever trusted David. The defense, in their last attempt, appealed to mercy, to the bonds of blood, to the hardships of addiction and loss. But the facts stood tall, unyielding. When the jury left to deliberate, I sat in the quiet and watched the morning sun shift across the courtroom floor. Alan squeezed my shoulder, a silent reassurance. The wait felt endless, the seconds dragging out, each tick of the clock another reminder of what had been lost. When the jury returned, I saw it on their faces before the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. David stood as the sentence was read, face pale, lips trembling, hands clenched so tight I thought they might never open again. 5 years for the theft, 3 for conspiracy, sentences to run concurrently. Aaron received probation, community service, a mandate to leave the house and begin again on her own terms. She wept quietly, tears tracking down her cheeks, but did not look at David as he was led away. The judge addressed David one last time, his words calm but firm. He spoke of consequences, of the importance of responsibility, of the pain a person can cause when they refuse to own their actions. He told David that redemption, if it came at all, would come from facing the truth and choosing to become someone better. I listened, my heart torn between relief and grief, the knowledge that justice had been served, but at the cost of everything I'd once held sacred. Outside the courtroom, the world went on. Reporters gathered at the steps, snapping photos, hurling questions that blurred together into a low drone. I moved past them, Alan at my side, feeling the weight of each step, the ache in my chest deeper than before. The air outside was sharp and cold, the city rushing by, unaware of the small tragedies unfolding in its heart. That night, alone in my empty house, I sat at the kitchen table, the verdict ringing in my ears. I looked at the photographs on the wall, of Lila, of David as a child, of holidays and milestones and ordinary days now tinged with sorrow. I wondered what she would have made of all this, what advice she might have given if she'd still been here. I realized then that justice, no matter how cleanly delivered, could never fully mend what had been broken. But as I watched the first snow begin to fall outside, blanketing the city in quiet, I found a strange sense of closure. The fight was over. The truth, for better or worse, was finally free. And while I couldn't go back and undo the pain, I could begin again. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that healing was possible. Not from forgetting, but from surviving, from learning to carry the weight and walk on, step by step, into whatever came next. Packing up the house took longer than I'd expected. I thought it would be a kind of therapy, boxing away the last 30 years of life in this weather-beaten Minneapolis suburb, putting old wounds on a shelf and locking the door behind me. But every drawer, every cabinet, had its own surprise. A faded birthday card from Lila tucked behind the phone book, David's childhood drawing of a smiling son taped to the inside of a closet, Erin's old scarf left in a laundry basket with the scent of her perfume still clinging faintly to the fabric. The weight of memory pressed against me at every turn, reminding me of how much I'd poured into this place, how much I'd lost. There were moments I had to stop, lean against the counter, and let the ache run its course before I could move again. The house was almost silent, each room echoing with the sound of packing tape, the scrape of cardboard, the hollow ring of furniture being moved. Erin came by once, eyes red, clutching a folder of court paperwork, collecting the last of her things. She lingered in the doorway, words catching on her tongue, apology and guilt and fear written on her face. I told her I hoped she'd find her own strength, that she could leave the past behind and make something new. She nodded, too tired for tears, and slipped away, the door closing quietly behind her. I wondered if she'd ever truly forgive herself, or if that was a mercy we only grant others, never ourselves. Alan stopped by in the afternoons, helping with the heavy lifting, making coffee, filling the empty spaces with small talk about the twins, the weather, the slow spread of spring thawing out the city. He never asked for details, never pressed for confessions or explanations. His friendship was steady, the kind that anchors you when your world has spun apart. We loaded the last of the boxes into the rented truck on a chilly Saturday morning, breath rising in clouds as we worked side by side in silence. The closing was as businesslike as you'd expect. I signed my name over and over, transferring ownership to a young couple expecting their first child. They walked through the house, giddy and nervous, the way Lila and I once had, 30 years ago, dreaming of a future too big to see. The wife asked if I had any advice, and I told her to fill the place with laughter, to forgive each other for the small things, to take pictures of the ordinary days because one day, those are the ones you'll miss most. She smiled, and I saw a flash of hope in her eyes. By the time I turned the key in the lock for the last time, the house was empty, stripped of all but the marks on the wall where we'd measured David's height, the nail holes from family photos, and the ghost of laughter still echoing in the halls. I stood on the porch, letting the memories wash over me, feeling both heavier and lighter than I had in years. My breath misted in the cold morning air as I whispered goodbye, a word too small for the life it carried. The drive west to Colorado felt surreal, miles of highway unspooling under the tires of my battered Ford, radio humming low, the sun rising over endless fields and wide-open sky. For a while, the grief rode with me in the passenger seat, a silent companion. I replayed the events of the last few months, the betrayal, the trial, the ache of watching David led away in cuffs. The pain was sharp, but beneath it, a new resolve was growing. A sense of possibility I hadn't felt since before Lila died. There was a strange comfort in the emptiness, a freedom I'd never thought to want. Every town I passed was a blank slate. Gas stations with neon signs buzzing against the blue, diners serving coffee strong enough to make your hands shake, strangers offering quick smiles and polite nods. Nobody knew my story. No one recognized my face from the local paper, or whispered about the old man whose family fell apart. I felt anonymous, and in that anonymity, I found a kind of peace. In Denver, I rented a small apartment on the edge of the city, not far from the foothills, where the mountains loomed silent and unyielding against the sky. The place was modest, one bedroom, old appliances, the windows a little drafty at night, but it was mine. I filled it with the bare essentials. Lila's photograph on the nightstand, a box of tools in the closet, a handful of books I couldn't bear to leave behind. I learned the rhythms of this new life slowly. Morning coffee on the balcony, afternoon walks in the city park, evenings spent tinkering with old fishing gear, letting my hands remember what it felt like to build something from scratch. I found work in a hardware store part-time, just enough to keep my mind busy and my days structured. The younger guys called me Mr. Harlan, respected my stories about the old days on the line, listened when I showed them how to fix a leaky faucet or sharpen a saw. Some afternoons, Alan would call to check in, his voice steady as ever, reminding me that home was not a place but a circle of people willing to stand with you when the world fell apart. The pain didn't vanish. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment David pointed at me, the cold accusation in his eyes. I wondered if he felt any regret, if prison would change him, or if some wounds never heal. Sometimes I caught myself missing him, missing the promise of the man he might have become. I let those feelings rise and fall, like the tide, and tried not to judge myself for grieving the loss of a son who was still alive. Slowly, though, I found small joys. There was a Saturday morning market where I bought fresh bread and apples, the vendor always asking if I needed anything else. I volunteered at a community center, teaching kids how to repair their bikes, watching their faces light up with the same curiosity David once had. I even adopted a stray dog, a scrappy mutt with a crooked tail, who greeted me at the door every night, eyes shining with uncomplicated trust. I named him Chance. Spring melted into summer, and with each passing day, the sharp edges of the past dulled a little more. I started keeping a journal, writing down the things I wished I'd said to Lila, to David, to myself. Some days the words came easy. Other days, I stared at the blank page, searching for forgiveness in the silence. It was at the hardware store, 6 months after I'd left Minneapolis, that I met a woman named Carla, a retired teacher with a gentle laugh and a kindness that seemed to fill whatever room she was in. She came in looking for a replacement part for her kitchen sink, and we got to talking about the best way to fix a leak. She invited me for coffee the next week, and I accepted. It was simple, ordinary, but for me it was everything. Over time, our friendship grew. Slowly, honestly, the way things do when you've both lived through heartbreak. She didn't ask about my past, and I didn't push for details about hers. We sat together on her porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, letting the silence say what words couldn't. Sometimes, when the air turned cool at dusk, I'd take chance for a walk along the creek, watching him chase shadows through the grass. I'd think about Lila, about all the ways she'd taught me to keep going, to find meaning in small things. I missed her fiercely, but I also felt her pride in the life I was building, in the courage it took to start over. I knew I would never be the man I was before. I would never unknow the pain, the betrayal, the long, cold walk through the valley of loss. But I also knew this. The story didn't end with David's choices, or with the trial, or even with me driving away from the only home I'd ever known. It ended and began again, with the decision to keep living, to forgive myself for the mistakes I'd made, and to open my heart, battered as it was, to whatever came next. That is the lesson I carry with me now. Each day a new chance to choose hope over regret, kindness over bitterness, and courage over fear. I can't change the past, but I can honor it by living the rest of my life with honesty, with humility, and with the quiet conviction that even in the wake of the deepest wounds, it's possible to find light again. So as I sit here tonight, the city lights twinkling in the distance, chants snoring softly at my feet, I feel a sense of peace I never thought I'd find. The story isn't about justice or revenge. Not really. It's about survival, about learning to let go, and about discovering that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning when to walk away and when to begin again.